What is going on, investors? Back again, another stock analysis. Right now, we're going to take a look at PayPal, ticker symbol PYPL. We'll take a look at the financials. This company just reported earnings just a couple days ago. We'll jump in here and just take a little high-level view of those. We'll jump into the stock chart as well here. The stock has been in a long-term uptrend. It broke trend, but we see right when it reported earnings, it gapped up back onto this trend, and so it's on the choo-choo train up the ladder. And so we'll take a look here. Maybe there's a spot where we can get shares as well. So full disclosure, I own a couple shares of PayPal, but it's not going to affect how I'll analyze this. The PE ratio on this one's elevated, as most of these kind of younger fintech companies tend to be, and PayPal is, as we dig in these financials, it's a nice growing business here. So we've just real quick look at the balance sheet here. That's what they lead off with their financials. We take a look here. We went short-term investments ticked up here about call it 3.5 billion, and cash went down just a little bit. Maybe some of it went into the short-term investments, but cash ticked up in the quarter. So as we look through the statement of operations, we want to see, is this coming from operations, or did this come from a debt raise? My guess, it came from a debt raise, because we come down here to long-term debt. We went from, call it 5 billion up to 9 billion. So that's about $4 billion. That's about what we were looking at here at the top of the balance sheet. So everything else here looks fine to me. You've got these funds receivable and customer accounts here at $29 billion for the period. And then finally, this is a 6-month period. We've got December here and June here. And then finally, that's balanced out here at funds payable to the accounts. So we've got about 31 billion here. So that actually ticked up favorably over the last period, and so did funds in the customer's accounts. So that's good. That's a number that you want to see. It is on the asset side. I just wanted to point that out, that's on the asset side, but it's also balanced out on the liability side, because that is not technically PayPal's money. So moving on, statement of operations. This is really interesting. So we've got a 3-month view here, 1920, 6-month view here, 1920. We see everything's doing just fine for PayPal. They're growing revenue a little bit. That's not a huge jump. We'll call that. We'll give them credit. That's about $1 billion improvement there. For the 6-month ended, you're looking closer to about $1.4 billion. Now, what I did want to point out here, everything else from the expense side looks like it's falling in line. I said PayPal was like a young fintech company. They've been around a long time. I've been using PayPal a while. They haven't been a public company since they've been spun out from eBay for very long, but their business and their business model is relatively mature. Now, one thing on the broader macroeconomic thing that you can kind of take away from PayPal are these transaction and credit losses. While they're not necessarily a big number affecting PayPal, we see, look, from 6 months ended, it was this time last year, it was 600 and call it 60 million. Now it's over $1 billion. That's almost twice as much. And we see here, even in the quarter here, it was elevated over the previous period. So that is showing you that there's more credit risk out there. There's more transaction losses. While again, it's not necessarily a big deal for PayPal, this is more me pointing out macro things that you can take from this, that there are people out there with PayPal accounts that are struggling. So how is that going to trickle down to the economy? Those are some things you can draw from reading reports like this, especially of PayPal and other banks and things like that. Now, total operating expenses ticked up a little bit. In fact, it probably ticked up almost as quickly as revenue ticked up. And we've seen the same thing here, but it's nothing really that big. This business, though, is not really growing that rapidly, especially when you take a look at the 6-month view here. You went from 1.5 billion up to 1.6 on the net income side. And then finally, it's growing a little faster. If you take a look at the most current quarter, you see that it went from 800 million up to, that's a really nice jump in net income, up to 1.53 billion. It's even better illustrated here in this earnings per share. You basically doubled, essentially almost doubled your earnings per share. Whether or not this quarter holds through and that continues, I don't know. I see some other income here that didn't occur in the previous period that seemed to really drive a lot of income down here. That's something, if you really wanted to, you could dig into. I would guess that this is probably somewhat of an anomaly. This business is going to keep growing. I don't think it's going to double its net income like this going forward, although it certainly would be nice if it does. Now, Moving down here, we've got a little bit of cash flow here. Cash flow is really solid. It's really consistent on this company. Things look fine for me. They did issue some common stock here. That's not that big of a deal. And that's about it. You know, there's not a whole lot going on here. It looks fine for me from a cash flow perspective. They're raising a little bit of money, but it's nothing that I would be too concerned about. Now, one last thing that I want to show you is active accounts here. So we've got active accounts. They give you like a quarter over quarter over quarter view. And so I like to see this, and it's actually trending up very nicely. So you got active accounts here. You got number of payment transactions right here. That is obviously ticking up here. Now, this is interesting. So we got payment transaction per active account. We see that number is stable. It's interesting. Whoever signs up for a PayPal account we'll just call this 40. We'll do about 40 transactions in each account. So as these numbers tick up in active accounts, you can really nicely project how many transactions each of those customers are going to do. It's about 40. It's a little over one per day. So that's awesome. We've got total payment volume. That's obviously ticking up as active accounts tick up, and those active accounts are acting similar to other accounts that are already in the system. Now, last thing with the credit rate loss rate. So what's interesting here is take a look where it was in March. So we went from very steady 18, 19, 19. I would guess that's a traditional kind of default rate that PayPal sees. And then boom, it ticked all the way up to 30. And so that's what I pointed out, that, you know, defaults and credit losses were increasing here. But here's the but. Back in June, it actually went back down to what I would consider a much more normal level. And so that's a good sign. So while we saw credit rates losses tick up, it's actually happening at a rate that's a little bit more traditional. So as long as this stays in that 18, 19, 20% range, I wouldn't be too concerned about it, at least from a PayPal business perspective, although these defaults definitely say something about the macro environment. Now, finally, where in the heck can we buy some PayPal shares? This chart looks a lot like Apple's chart to me. Made a bottom down here, and then it had this huge defined uptrend where it tested here, it bounced here, and then finally, a couple weeks ago, it broke trend. And then once it broke trend, this line all of a sudden isn't support, it's resistance. But when earnings got reported right here, boom, the stock gaps up here. And now we've seen it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's like, it's holding this line, but this isn't necessarily what I would call a really a strong hold. So for me, if I wanted to get into PayPal, I think your first level where you can look is right here, because this is where the gap occurred. And so if this stock breaks this trend again, I think it's going to try to fill this gap here and come back to this level. We'll call it 185-ish. So somewhere in the 185 level for me would be an interesting spot if you wanted to start a new position. Although if it's at this 185 level and it breaks, I think you're going to retest maybe these lows back down into call it 75, even 176. But if this trend line holds, believe me, this stock is going to keep trending up. It might even go all the way up to $200 per share. But for me, I'd like to see if it holds this trend line here and we get some positive news on the economy. That might be good. If this stock breaks this trend, comes back down here, I think its most natural spot is in the call it 184, 185 range. I think that would be an interesting spot to kind of pick up shares if you want to get long PayPal. Now, there is some risk to buying shares. I just want to just say we're pointing out levels here, because you can come in here and draw all kinds of trend lines and things like that. There's this, what I like to do is just figure out ranges where I'd like to buy shares. Would I go all in at the 180 level? No, probably not. If it drops down here to 164, yeah, maybe, if there's not a lot of negative news. But there's all kinds of like levels where you can see you can buy shares of this stock. Up here at this elevated level, I think it's a little bit risky. You're basically just betting that this trend line holds, which it does. Once this stock is on this choo-choo train, it tends to go up. But as you can see, when it decides to break, it will break until you get some positive news. And that is what we saw in PayPal. So this is a $200 billion company. They're not making a ton of money yet. So this is an elevated PE. And from a revenue perspective, it's an expensive stock. stock, but they've got a lot of tailwinds and a lot of momentum behind the stock. So this is one I think you want in your portfolio. If you don't got any direct exposure to PayPal, you might want to look for an ETF with exposure to PayPal, Square, maybe some of the other banks in there might give you less volatility, but then give you exposure to these higher growing fintech stocks like PayPal. So there we go. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. We'll be back again soon. Thank you everybody for subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. I've just crossed 10,000 subscribers, and I want to thank all of you for making that happen. I'll be back again very soon. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. Good luck with your investments.